Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Jack Klieger, and I'm the president and CEO of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And I want to welcome you to the third and final session of this year's Fanya Gottesfeld Heller Conference for educators. It has been a pleasure learning with you as we have focused this year on the topic of art and the Holocaust. We are, as always, grateful to the family of the museum's dear friend of blessed memory, Fanya Gottesfeld Heller, for their ongoing support of Holocaust education at the museum. We have been honored to have them join the past two sessions of the annual conference, and we are especially grateful for the participation of Mrs. Heller's grandson, Joseph Warren, at last week's session, whose remarks illuminated beautifully the issues regarding the legacy of the Holocaust among descendants of survivors. With this conference, we continue to honor Mrs. Heller's memory. Mrs. Heller was a survivor, a philanthropist, and an author who taught countless students and educators during her remarkable life. She remains a great inspiration as we fulfill our mission to educate about the Holocaust. Today's program will look at how examining portraits from the Holocaust can open a window to the past for your students. So thank you all for participating. And at this time, I'd like to invite Elizabeth Edelstein, the museum's Vice President for Education, to begin the program. Liz?
Thank you, Jack. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure and honor to begin today's program. We're so glad you could join us. Our speaker today is Professor Rachel E. Perry of Tel Aviv University. Professor Perry received her doctorate in art history from Harvard University. Her research includes the fields of art history, visual culture, and Holocaust studies, with a strong focus on visual ethics, material culture, and art history, visual culture, and Holocaust studies, with a strong focus on visual ethics, material culture, atrocity photography, exhibition design, and the relationship between aesthetics and politics. Professor Perry's articles have appeared in numerous journals, including History and Memory, Holocaust Studies, a journal of cultural and history, and Art Bulletin, to name just a few. In 2018, Professor Perry curated the exhibition Arrivals Departures, the Oscar Gez collection at the Hecht Museum in Haifa. She currently teaches in the Weiss Livnat graduate program in Holocaust Studies at Haifa University in Israel. It's my pleasure now to invite Professor Perry to guide us through a close examination of portraits along with other artwork from the Holocaust. Professor Perry?
Thank you so much, Jack Klieger and Liz Edelstein. It is a great pleasure for me to speak to you today for many reasons, not the least of which is that one of my former graduate students is currently an intern at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and my crazy talented first cousin, Elise Buxbaum, is marking her one-year anniversary as your Executive Vice President for Strategy and Development. You are lucky to have her, as I'm sure you know, and I want to thank her for making the shidduch today. These connections help bridge the geographical distance between us. On a personal note, I'd like to say that although I live in Israel, I was born and raised in the United States in New Haven, Connecticut. And when I posted the announcement of this lecture on my website, I was so moved by the number of emails and comments that I received from friends and family who were profoundly touched by Fanya Gottesfeld Heller. My mother, Sydney Perry, among them, who served as the executive director of the Jewish Federation in New Haven, and who met and worked with Fanya on the Holocaust Education Prejudice Reduction Program in the greater New Haven area. I hope that today's talk will honor her memory. And with that, I will share my screen. Okay. In the summer of 1943, as the Nazis stepped up their extermination of European Jewry, the Jewish-French writer and art critic Léon Werth, to whom Antoine de Saint-Exupéry dedicated The Little Prince, wrote, quote, "All will be forgotten, tossed into the trash cans of history." Only a few months later, on October 7th, 1943, Heinrich Himmler delivered a secret speech to top leading senior SS officers in Poznan, or Posen, in which he stressed that we will, quote, "never speak of the extermination of the Jews in public. The history of the final solution would be, quote, a glorious page that will never be written," end quote. As Primo Levi has argued, the Nazi project was, in its essence, a war against memory. So little remains, the victims were murdered, their property was plundered. What is left is mainly the German documentation, photographs which tell the story of the Holocaust from the point of view of the perpetrators, their collaborators, the bystanders, and yes, even the liberators, each with their own agendas. We have all seen these horrible photographs, the piles of corpses, the humiliations, the executions, the victimization, and the dehumanization. We have them in our mind's eye, and I don't have to reproduce them here, or rather, I choose not to. As important as these images are, these iconic photographs are to our cultural imaginary and to the historical record, they cannot on their own show the Holocaust's full face.
Rachel, I'm so sorry to interrupt. The images on our screen, on viewer's screen, are very fuzzy. Is there anything you can do? If not, I can try and share them from my screen.
Does this work better, Liz?
No, sadly not. Still very fuzzy. How would it be if you were to tell me next screen, and I'll give it a try?
Okay, sure. Do you have, I don't understand. Do you have the PowerPoint?
I do.
Or?
I do. I have the PowerPoint. Everybody, thank you for your patience while we get this technical difficulty set up. Thanks for your patience. Okay, Rachel, give me a moment and you can stop sharing and I will set up to start sharing.
Okay, fine.
It's on its way. It's loading. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Okay, just a moment. Let me see if I can set myself up or if I need help sharing my screen. Jacqueline Smith, could you make it possible for me to share my screen, please?
Yes, Liz.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if this works any better. Give me a moment and I'll start it as a slideshow.
Oh no.
Wrong one.
Losing precious.
Are you able to see, Rachel?
I am.
This doesn't look like the right one, does it?
No, I made a few changes. Okay.
Okay, I think we were here though, weren't we?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
I'm going to mute myself again if I can. Jacqueline, could you mute me, please? Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to continue then. Yes, so I wanted to think about portraits and with this phrase in mind, from Walter Benjamin, who was himself a German Jewish refugee who was, unfortunately, who committed suicide as he was trying to flee Nazi-occupied France in the Pyrenees. And this beautiful idea of writing history means to give dates their physiognomy, to give dates and to give history, in fact, its shape. It's a human face, in other words. How do we face the effaced, and how do we remember the dismembered? How do we bring forth history, and in both senses of the term, to face the Holocaust, to confront it, but also to figure it? And one of the ways that I will argue, one of the best ways that I know how, is by looking at works that were made by the victims themselves, and in particular, the genre of portraiture. If you can click on the next slide, Liz. Liz, can you click on the next slide, please? Yeah. Okay. Why portraits? The portrait has a long and illustrious history in the history of art. Certainly, as long as artists were considered individual creators and not anonymous craftsmen working in collective guilds. In other words, since the Renaissance, the genre, the type of the portrait has had a great deal of importance. But during the period of the Holocaust in particular, portraits and self-portraits assume a new and a special importance. In fact, art historians have estimated that on average about a third, close to a third of all of the artistic production during this period consist of portraits. And so I ask my students, and I would ask you to kind of, as modeling this for you, why artists would turn to the portrait during this period. There's a very practical reason. One is that artists, photographers, people did not have access to cameras. It was illegal to own a camera in the ghettos and certainly in the camps, although we have some exceptions to this. Artists use the portrait in order to recollect, to capture a physical likeness, to commemorate a loved one, to record it as evidence, documentation. They used portraits as gifts and to barter for for a crust of bread, for instance. And they were forced to make portraits under duress by coercion for the Nazis themselves. If you could turn to the next slide, Liz, please. Yeah, and what I'm showing you here is in fact a very beautiful photographic portrait by the surrealist artist Man Ray of Benjamin Fondane. Fondane was a surrealist artist. He was originally from Romania. He came to Paris, like so many artists did in the 1920s, to join the avant-garde, to have artistic as well as religious and political freedom, and writes this really absolutely beautiful poem that I will read to you here. And I think that it really encapsulates some of the reasons why the portrait becomes so important. If you would turn to the next slide, please. Could you turn to the next slide, please? Yeah. This is another portrait of Fondane by Victor Brauner. It is to you I speak. I speak man to man with the little in me of man that remains, with the scrap of voice left in my throat. A day will come of thirst appeased, and we will be beyond memory. Death will have finished the work of hate. I will be a clump of needles at your feet. Ah, then know that I had a face like you. Yes, exactly like you, a mouth that prayed like you. Yes, I was cruel. I yearned for tenderness, for power, for gold, for pleasure. I was a man like other men. I loved, I wept, I hated, I suffered. I bought flowers and I did not always pay my rent. And he continues, like you, I read all of the bestsellers, all the papers, and I have understood nothing of the world, and I have understood nothing of man, though it often happened that I affirmed the contrary. And when death came, maybe I pretended to know what it was, but now truly I can tell you at this hour, it has fully entered my astonished eyes. Astonished to understand so little, have you understood more than I? And next slide, and then he does this about face and he says, and yet no, I was not a man like you. You were not born on the roads. No one threw your little ones like blind kittens into the sewer. You did not wander from city to city hunted by the police. You did not know the disasters of daybreak, the cattle cars, the sob of a basement, accused of a wrong you did not do, changing your name and your face, so as not to bear a jeered at name and a face that has served for all the world as a spittoon. And then he says, a day will come when this poem will find itself before your eyes. He's writing to us. It asks nothing, forget it. But when you trample on this bunch of nettles that had been me in another century, in a history that you will have canceled, remember only that I was innocent and that like all of you, I too had a face that was marked by rage, by pity and joy, quite simply a human face. And I think one of the things that he is suggesting here in this very, very beautiful poem, the last lines of which are inscribed on the Hall of Names at Yad Vashem at the very conclusion of the museum, he's suggesting on the one hand, the face is what establishes our common humanity, what connects us with one another, makes us all part of the human race, and yet it also establishes our individuality. But for him, particularly as a Jewish person, the face was what set him apart from the master race. The face was what marked him as somebody to be persecuted. And if you could turn to the next slide, please. Okay, this is at Yad Vashem. And next slide, please. Okay, yes, okay. So the face is in fact, during this period, one of the things that I would insist upon, in fact, is that so much of Nazi ideology and so much of the anti-Semitic propaganda was centered around the human face. And the study of physiognomy, the study of the human face, the Jewish face, and the markers of the Jewish face for the markers of criminality, of insanity, of degeneracy. One of the things that artists are doing, in fact, is reclaiming the anti-Semitic stereotype and figuring themselves and representing themselves, and not as objects, dehumanized objects, but rather as agents of their own lives during this period. So there's this insistence on the personhood. If you could turn to the next slide. We're looking at, and I know that Eliade Moret-Rosenberg spoke with you about Felix Nussbaum. I'm not going to go over all of the material that she presented to you, but I do want to focus on this one painting. This is a very famous painting. It's presented at the very end of the Felix Nussbaum Museum in Osnabrück. And certainly one of the things about a portrait is that it captures a kind of treasure trove of clues that gives us insight into how the artist was thinking and feeling. Artists not only make choices about what to paint, but how to paint it. And these can be chosen or they can be imposed upon the artist. When we look at this painting, one of the most, I think, striking things about it is how close up it is. He's almost touching the picture plane. He's represented himself very close, almost so close that one could touch it. And when one goes to see this in person, your eyes line up almost directly with his eyes. In other words, you're really looking at him on the same level. It's rather striking. If I had my cursor, I could show you that in most traditional portraits, when the artist represents himself or their sitter, they will center it in the composition so that there's an even amount of space, a kind of frame around it. Felix Nussbaum doesn't do that with this work. In fact, he is in the bottom half of the composition. And this creates a sense, a great sense, I think, of pressure bearing down upon him. A sense that he is almost quite literally, he is underground. He's within the architectural enclosure, but he's also very much, the upper half of this composition feels like, even though it's open to the sky, feels like it is weighting him down. And he is also within the architectural space, trapped within it. There's a sense of claustrophobia, of entrapment, of feeling really like he's hit a dead end and is given no recourse, that he is trapped. What he's doing though, and I want to focus on this, Eliad mentioned some of the symbols of the flocks of birds, the gray cloud, the branches of this limbless tree. I want to look exactly at how he represents himself. It's very, very, I think, noticeable that there's a very strong source of light that is coming at him. It's coming from the left and it's shining on him with, it's a kind of artificial light. You see that the sky is dark. It's probably early evening. And yet you have this very strong illumination on his face. The light source is the light source of a flashlight or something that somebody is shining on him. And he's making eye contact. He's looking right back at the viewer. This is one of the most interesting works from this period because Felix Nussbaum implicates us as an audience, as viewers, as visitors. In this dialogue, in this encounter. And one has to ask, who are we? Who is he looking at? Who is the person who is shining this bright light at him? And what are they asking him to do? Well, they're asking to see his papers. They're asking to see his papers, which he delivers in his left hand, and his Jewish star. In other words, he puts us in the position of a perpetrator, a police officer, or somebody who is asking him what he's doing outside. This is made in early 1943. The law requiring Jews in Belgium goes into effect in the spring of 1942, in May of 1942, and there was a curfew enacted shortly thereafter. In August of 1942, the first deportations take place from Belgium, from Malines or Mechlin to Auschwitz. Felix Nussbaum is living in a period really precarious. And I think you can get this feeling from this work, above all, of a kind of mood, a tone of angst, of really impending doom. It's largely monochromatic, very, very dark, both literally and figuratively. And he is representing himself as a hunted Jew, as somebody who's living in Belgium with no residency papers, who is who's hit, who's living underground in hiding and who's hit a dead end. But very importantly, he is looking back at us, not with fear and trepidation so much as a kind of confrontation. He's looking at us in the eye, almost as if to say, who are you? Where are you implicated in this? Are you my perpetrator? Are you a bystander? And really forcing that confrontation. You can see also noticeably on his paper, he represents a photograph of himself wearing a pointed hat. It looks a little bit like this film noir hat that he's got on over here. Yes.
I'm so sorry. Your sound is breaking up a little. Could you for a moment turn off your video in the hopes that it will improve your sound? Thank you. Can you continue now? Can we hear you? Rachel, we're not able to hear you, so why don't you try turning your video back on?
Can you hear me now? Is
Yes.
that better? Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
This is not, we're having more than one technical glitch. I'm very sorry. Okay, and certainly one of the things that we can notice here in this, the papers that he's showing us is a hat with a triangular hat. This is a hat that Jews were forced to wear throughout Europe in the Middle Ages that marked them as Jews. So he's kind of speaking to that, certainly. Can you hear me now? Is that working?
Yes, it's a little, maybe try speaking a little bit softer.
Softer, okay.
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so Liz, can you turn to the next image, please? Yes. Another artist who, I should just say that Felix Nussbaum was denounced by the neighbors, in fact, and arrested by the German, by the Gestapo in July of 1944. And then less than a month before the Allies liberated Belgium and Brussels, he and his wife were on the very last transport to Auschwitz, and they died there. You're looking here at an artist who's, it says my speaker's not working.
We can hear you.
Okay. Adolf Itzik Feder was an artist that was born in Odessa in the Ukraine and arrived in Paris in 1908 and studied there and really amassed an absolutely impressive collection of artworks. And I think you can see that in the next slide, Liz. Yeah, it's a beautiful photograph of him in his studio in Paris wearing a Bukharin kippah and in front of all of the tribal art and art that he had collected from Palestine. And here he is, in fact, in the same pose as this photograph that he had commissioned. If you look at that earlier painting that he made of himself, he's standing in the same pose with his vest, his hands in his pockets. The difference here, of course, is that he has a Jewish star on his lapel and that he is no longer in his beautiful art studio able to make art, but he is now behind barbed wire in the camp of Drancy outside of Paris. What you can see here is his, steel bed and this background behind him. but very important that he's representing himself like Felix Nussbaum as somebody having to wear the Jewish star in this condition, in the same pose, almost kind of like the transformation of the individual forced by circumstance. If you look at the next slide, please, and then the following one. These are some other of the portraits that he made while he was in Drancy of children with their meager food portions and of men reading, all wearing the Jewish star. And the next, women as well in the camp. He's absolutely intent in each one of these of marking, signing, and then carefully dating by month and day when these portraits were made. If you can look at the next one. These were all portraits that were saved thanks to his wife. His wife, here you can see a photograph of her in the Jardin at the Place de la Concorde, whose name was Sima, whose niece still lives in Ramat Aviv. I had the good pleasure of meeting her. And Sima, in fact, survived Drancy, and because she had a Palestine passport from Palestine, which is where she had lived, which was under the British mandate, and this gave her a different status. But thanks to this fact, we have these works that she donated to the Ghetto Fighters House Museum and to Yad Vashem, among others. And he wrote her a letter as he was being deported to Auschwitz to have courage and to be in good spirits. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. What you're looking at here is a work that was actually made of Auschwitz, not from Auschwitz. This is a work that was made by another French artist who had come to Paris. In fact, he was born in Warsaw, but he came to Paris during the 1920s and was deported to Auschwitz, back to Poland, in fact. And after he survives, he comes back and makes a series of works that detail and record his experiences in Auschwitz. He worked in many different functions when he was in the camp. Can you look at the next one, Liz? He was a translator. You can see him here, Olere, on the left with the radio. He also decorated lampshades for some of the capos and some of the SS officers. Can you look at the next, please? He was also, for a short period of time, a member of the Sonderkommando that was forced to remove bodies from the gas chambers. Next slide, please. Here, these are some of the most graphic works of art that we have that document this period. Next slide, please. And next. And even architectural drawings that he made after the war ended, which were used at some of the trials as evidence, in fact. Now, one of the things that we see in that first work, if you can scroll to the next one, Liz. Next, please. This is a drawing, an illustrated, decorated letter, in fact. And Liz, I'm sorry to do this, but it's hard to not be in control here. If you can scroll back to that first one, which says "For a Crust of Bread," the first work by David Olere. Yes, and what we see him doing here, this is one of the things that artists were forced to do in the camp. Here, this is a self-portrait of him, but a self-portrait of him being forced to do something absolutely humiliating, shaming. He is refusing to make eye contact with us in the way that Nussbaum did. He's looking down at the task at hand, and what he's doing, in fact, is drawing, decorating a letter for a crust of bread. This is one of the many different things that artists were enlisted or coerced to do in the camps. We talk about this very often as a kind of insurance policy. Being able to paint, being able to make a portrait of somebody gave an artist a certain immunity. It could make the difference between survival and death. What he's being forced to do here at great, and you can see the kind of enforcement by these two soldiers that are standing above him with their arms really straddling him and locking him in on either side, this kind of echoing backwards, is they're making sure that he does what he needs to do as well as he can do it. This kind of forced labor, very often the misnomer here is that this is commissioned art. This is a kind of compulsory work that artists were forced to do, to put some beautiful calligraphy onto paintings, to adorn letters with flowers and so on. If we look at the composition here, you see this very sharp diagonal from the upper right corner down to the lower bottom left corner, and it brings our eye down. We are standing, our perspective in space is a kind of aerial perspective, and so what this gives Olere what it allows Olere to do is to show us this horizontal surface onto which he is doing what he is doing for a crust of bread. So we see this vantage point. You have a sense of coercion there. Olere wrote about this after the war and said that I earn my bread and survival for today by decorating their love letters with flowers, and that kind of absolutely dastardly thing of having to decorate a love letter in Auschwitz. It may also be requested to write addresses in Gothic letters. It's chic, it looks nice, it's German. One of the things I think that is so important here with his eyes downcast, this experience of deep victimization, he is doing what Lawrence Langer called, he is given a choiceless choice. One was not choosing to paint or to work for the Nazis. One was, in fact, pulled into this with great reluctance and embarrassment and shame, in fact. If you can turn to the next slide after Olere, Liz, keep on going. Next. Next. Yes, next. This is an artist by the name of Dinah Gottliebova Babitt. She's an artist who makes two different kinds of work in Auschwitz under different circumstances and different motives. Both of them commissioned, but by different people and for different purposes. What you're looking at here look like rather unremarkable portraits. They're portraits of Roma and Sinti women. If you turn to the next slide, please. And in fact, she was brought in to Auschwitz from Terezin, from the ghetto of the camp of Terezin. She was Czech, and she came in with her mother and was an artist who had come to the attention of Franz Lucas, who was Josef Mengele's second in command. And then she was brought into Mengele's office and commanded, really, to make portraits of the Sinti and the Roma that were being kept sequestered in the separate Sinti and Roma camp. And what you see here are some of these 12, 13 of these portraits of these individuals. If you can turn to the next slide. This is Dinah Gottliebova with her mother and also as a sculptor. She fully recognizes that her drawing and artistic skills saved her life. Here you can see her, a really beautiful young woman who was a recognized artist and is tapped by a man by the name of Freddy Hirsch. If you can turn to the next slide. To make some wall decorations for the children in the family camp. Now, this is an absolute aberration, an anomaly in Auschwitz, but in January of 1943, in January of 1944, there was a transport from Terezin to Auschwitz of a family camp, a family transport. And it was the only time, aside from the Sinti and Roma, that all of the members of the family were kept together, the men, women, and children. They were not shaved, they were not selected and divided to go to work, but they were kept together. This was part of a ruse. This was part of a kind of, dastardly plan, in fact, to fool the Red Cross, who was going to be coming to Terezin in the summer of 1944. And so the idea was that they would send these people on ahead, and they would be able to report back and to send letters back and to verify that nothing was happening in Auschwitz that should cause alarm. So the children are there, and they are invited. They invite Dinah Gottliebova, next slide please, to make some beautiful decorations on the walls of the children's barrack. If you can play that, please.
Rachel, I'm not sure I can play it. I don't seem, well, let me try clicking one more time.
It's okay. You know what? Let's do this. I did make this PowerPoint available to you. I will share it with you, as long as you don't publish it, as if you use it for your personal use and to share with your students. So one of the things that you will be able to do is to look this up and to watch the entire clip that I've provided for you, okay? And that's something that I'm making available to you, so we'll leave it at that. So what you're looking at here is a portrait of Freddy Hirsch, this lovely man who was in charge of the children. He wanted to delight them. He wanted to keep on educating them and to amuse them. And so he asked Dinah Gottliebova Babitt to make a fresco. Next slide, please. And what she decides to paint for them, in fact, is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the film which came out that Disney released in 1937, I believe, or 38. There's a wonderful graphic novel called Snow White in Auschwitz, which recounts this. Next slide, please. And also a short video that was made. Next slide, please. Yes. Dinah Gottliebova Babitt, I should say, was, so she makes these two very different things. One for the children based on Disney character, a kind of fantasy, and to give joy to the children. And on the other hand, a work that was imposed upon her, that she was forced to make for Mengele for his studies of skin tones. And I'll just say this really briefly before I turn to the next work. He asked her to paint for him because photography was not accurate enough. Color photography, which had only been introduced as a new technology in the 1940s, and was not, in his mind, accurate enough to get the skin tones. So he needed an artist to come in and to make these watercolors to give him a better rendition for his studies of racial differences. What you're looking at here is another artist who came into Auschwitz from Terezin, Yehuda, who is still alive and well today in Jerusalem. This is a work that he makes called In Memory of the Czech Transport. This is a work, he comes in at the age of 13 to Terezin. He establishes himself, he hangs out with and familiarizes himself with the artists in Terezin. There were many of them. And then when he comes into Auschwitz, he recalls Dinah Gottliebova's frescoes. He knew Freddy Hirsch personally. So it's not just that they're meeting in my PowerPoint, but that they knew each other at the time. He comes in and with his father is in the family camp and makes this work immediately after the Holocaust, when he is released. He's actually sent on a death march to Mauthausen, and makes this work not only in memory, but also from memory. This is not a traditional portrait. It certainly doesn't resemble the portraits that Dinah Gottliebova made of the Roma. It's using only charcoal on a very thin, frail piece of paper. And I think we can say not a traditional portrait by any means, where a sitter is sitting in front of the artist. So it's something that he is recalling and almost conjuring up. It is, in fact, a portrait of his father. The loose sketchiness suggests remembrance, and I think if I would want to make a very important distinction here about this work. It's a work that is figurative, but not realistic by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, it is surreal. So that we have this head, this absolutely disproportionately large head, disembodied, kind of floating in this ethereal, ghost-like apparition in the air above the neck of the crematoria, of the chimney of the crematoria. So it's this kind of dislocation in scale, but also in body, and the kind of frenzied motion of the hand gestures of the charcoal that are almost kind of furiously scratching back and forth, convey a great sense of emotion and of a kind of release, let's say, a kind of feeling that the artist is also very much under the sway of. This is a work that he, if you can turn to the next slide, Liz, that he talks about, and I've tried to bring you as many of these videos from the USC Shoah Foundation so that you can hear them in their own words. So you'll have to do that at a later point in time. Next slide, please. These are some of the works that he makes as soon as he's released. This shows before he's transported to Terezin. Next slide. And then these works that are actually used in the Eichmann trial hearing in Jerusalem in '61, as well as in the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial in '63 and '65. Yehuda was from Czechoslovakia, and when he comes into the family camp, their cards are stamped with a word Sonderbehandlung, or special treatment. What this meant was that they had a period of kind of protection of 6 months, and after which the family camp would be liquidated, which it was in July of 1944. Next slide, please. Next slide, yeah. What you can see actually, if you can go back to that first slide of In Memory of the Czech Transport, Liz, where we're just looking at the individual slide. I think it's 4 back. Yeah, thank you. What we see here is written in the bottom right corner, 22H10-744. This is the place where an artist would normally sign and date a work of art when they make it. In fact, what is stamped here is the exact moment, as he said, when we were separated from our parents and they were sent to the gas chambers. This is the moment he knew that his father had been, in fact, gassed and then burned. So this work is very important, not only because of what it's representing. This is a kind of recollection. His father's face, in fact, this is a kind of metonymy. His father's face stands in for the entire transport and calls to mind the entire transport, the one for the many. But it's also, I think, very much also a kind of symbol, right, of the grave in the air. And what he's using here is charcoal. The material is really the message here. The charcoal, which is a material that is, after all, ash. And he's literally figuring, conjuring up his father's face, I think, out of ash, the very ash that had kind of dematerialized into so many particles in the sky. If you can turn to the next, please, Liz, the next artist. That's the artist Josef Szajna. Next, yeah, and one more. Yes, and this is a work called Our Biographies. I think this, more than any of the other works that I've shown you, really stands out. One could even really ask the question, is this a portrait? It's called Our Biographies. It's a work that I would argue is a group portrait of a certain kind. It is representing a large crowd of people seen from afar, of inmates who are wearing the prisoner uniforms. You can see here all those stripes and those lines and the heads. Can you look at the next slide, please, Liz? This is actually a photograph of the artist, Szajna, who was Polish Catholic political prisoner, was arrested and deported to Auschwitz as an adolescent. He made an escape attempt and was transferred to Buchenwald, and makes this work, Our Biographies, while he's in the infirmary in Buchenwald. It is a representation of, if you can turn to the next slide, of what is called the appel, this excruciating torture of standing several times a day for lengthy periods of time at roll call. This is a photograph of that, but if you turn to the next few slides, you'll see different representations of the roll call by artists like Zinovi Tolkachev, Siwek, next slide, Ella Liebermann-Shiber, a roll call, and Halina Olomucki. Next slide. Jan Komski as well. Next slide. I hope that I gave you, yes. And then we're looking at how different, in fact, Szajna's rendition of this same thing is. I would call this an absolute economy of means. It is minimalist. He's making a group portrait, in fact, a collective, plural representation of anonymous masses of people that is out of 2 elements only, and only using ink, the fingerprint of the heads, if you can make those out, and then this stamp of those striped uniforms. And one of the things I think that we see here, for me, it's extremely important, is how he goes about making this work. If you imagine, and I would actually encourage you and your students to imagine how it is made with this imprinting, not the artist's brush or hand-drawn line, but this kind of stamping technique that suggests an assembly line, kind of mass production, a gesture that is repeated over and over and over again as so many rows of kind of human inventory with very little individuality and kind of variation there. What's really important in these, the use of the fingerprint is, of course, that from afar, this just looks like a kind of, faceless mass. But in fact, we know that each and every fingerprint is absolutely unique. It is shared by no one else. And so he's able to kind of play on these 2 different registers, how the men at roll call, the women at roll call were perceived as just ciphers, faceless numbers, and yet insisting here on the individual, the unique biographies of each and every one of these inmates. I also think that the fingerprint raises up certain questions of the criminal inventory from the police archive, the way that in our society we certainly label and identify criminals through this fingerprint, one of the ways that we survey and control them. And so it also has this connotation as well. So yes, a very, very, I think, interesting and really unique work, which is largely abstract. And I would even argue more than that, a conceptual work. This is really a work that is conceptual in its nature. Next work, please. So I don't have so much time, but I did want to show you 2 final works. One is by Zofia Stepien-Bator. This is a portrait of Mala Zimctbaum. And what's so important to think about here is not necessarily what is being represented, who is being represented, but if we look at the condition of the work itself, you can see, I hope you can see on Liz's screen a little bit better than on my screen. There's a crease down the middle and then several horizontal lines. It looks like this has been folded and packaged up several times, probably to fit into a pocket, to be kept and held, something secret, not to be shown, that would be carried on one's self. As a kind of memento, as something of personal significance and value. This was a portrait that was made by Zofia Stepien-Bator in Auschwitz. If you can look at the next one, and it's made with crayons, colored crayons on cardboard. Cardboard was not a material that was easy to come by. It was heavy duty, we would say, durable, something that's strong, that wouldn't just rip and become torn and worn. But this was provided to her by the woman that sat for her, Mala Zimctbaum. Next slide, please. This is Mala Zimctbaum, a woman who was born in Belgium. Actually, she was born in Poland, moved to Belgium with her family, and then she is caught in Antwerp, actually, and sent to Auschwitz. And when she's in Auschwitz, she has a rather privileged position because she speaks many languages. She has her own room. She has access to materials, and she is a translator for the Nazis. And Zofia Stepien, the artist, is summoned one day and asked by Mala Zimctbaum to paint her portrait for her boyfriend, for her lover. If you can turn to the next slide. Who was named Edek or Edward Galinsky, who came into Auschwitz, in fact, on the very first transport in 1940. He comes in, I think, in June of 1940. He's one of the very earliest prisoners. In fact, I think his number was something like 531. And together they make a plan that they're going to escape from the camp. Galinsky is the one that Mala makes this beautiful, commissions this beautiful portrait for as a kind of gesture of her love. And the two of them decide that they're going to escape together. Next slide. It's really a rather beautiful love story in Auschwitz. He's the figure all the way on the right, working in one of the workshops in one of the subcamps. Next slide. And these are some of the testimonies that the artist makes that will be in the PowerPoint for you to listen to afterwards in Polish, but with translation. Next slide. Next slide, please. There's actually, the Auschwitz Museum has a whole collection of graphic novels that they put together. This one is about Mala Zimctbaum and Edek Galinsky. It's called Love in the Shadow of Death, and it tells their story and also the story of this beautiful portrait that she makes. Next slide, please. Next slide. And you can still see today some of the graffiti on the wall. They were captured, they were imprisoned, they actually survived for 3 weeks outside of the camp and captured, brought back in, tortured in the separate prison cells. Here the graffiti says Mala Zimctbaum with her number and Galinsky with his number. And he was publicly hanged with 5 other men, and she, shortly before she was about to be hung, took a razor blade out, slit her wrists, and the Nazi was so enraged, he said, "Our job is to kill you. You don't get to decide when you're going to die. That's for us to decide." And reached out to take her hand, and she supposedly slapped him. There's very hard to tell the difference between fact and legend here, but she certainly goes down as somebody who was the first woman, a Jewish woman certainly, to escape from the camp, and a real kind of heroine for so many of the women that recalled her. Next slide, please. Saying really very inspiring things. You know, "I will fall a heroine and you will die as a dog," she says to the Nazi. "Courage, friends, liberation is in sight, revolt, rise up," and so on. This portrait is rather unique as well, because what she's doing here, the artist Zofia Stepien, is idealizing the sitter. She is embellishing, she's making her look certainly more beautiful. She's flattering the sitter in a way that certainly one was not dressed like this, with a beautiful scarf in the camp, with her hair coiffed and curled the way that it is, with lipstick and rouge and so on. The artist is, in fact, embellishing her and making her look really attractive and beautiful and idealizing her. This is one way of giving so many of the people there a degree of respect, a kind of individuality, a kind of subjectivity that was being denied them at every turn. Next slide, please. In the few minutes that I have left, and I really do want to give you some opportunity, certainly, to ask some questions and to follow up. The last work that I want to introduce to you is a work by Charlotte Salomon. It's called Life ? Or Theater. It is, I think, one of the most ambitious, one of the most impressive works, in fact, from this period. And a work that is hard to kind of pin down. It is genre bending in the best of ways, maybe even of the 20th century. It's a work that was astonishingly made in under a year's time in 1941 by a woman who was only 24 years old, and consists of about 665 pages of painted gouache with textual narration, musical cues, stage directions. She's making this work when she is a refugee in exile, and she learns that all of the women in her family had, in fact, committed suicide and killed themselves, her mother, her aunt, her cousin, her grandmother. So she uncovers a family secret. Next slide, please. And one of the things I think, I'm having a hard time seeing you. There we go. That she says is the world was disintegrating more and more. My spirit was collapsing more and more. Desperately unhappy, I began this project at hand, driven by a question. Notice that it says Life ? Or Theater at the title. The question is this: should she follow in their path, in their shoes, and kill herself, or should she undertake something wildly unusual, which is in fact what she does, and that's this project, which I would argue is really a portrait in 1,000 parts. When lives were considered expendable, she's not only Jewish, but stateless. She was born and raised in Germany, and moves to the south of France at this time to take refuge there. But she's also female. So many of these artists that we've seen today are cultivating an individuality that the Nazis meant to cut down. And she is reassembling her own identity when conditions were really wearing down exiles who were feeling displaced and uprooted. If you can turn to the next slide, please. Yes. What you're looking at here is the link to the webpage for an interactive webpage for the museum in Amsterdam that houses this entire magnum opus. If you can turn to the next slide, please. So what is Charlotte Salomon doing? She is, I think you can see here, I hope you can see here. This looks like a curtain being pulled back. What she's doing here is telling her story, her autobiography, but in fact, she's telling it through the third person. She is creating a theater almost to a certain extent, and she's arranged this with a prelude, a main part, and an epilogue. She's divided it into acts and scenes with dialogue, annotated for music as well. She gives stage directions and flashbacks and has a playbill, pulls the curtain back to introduce us to the characters. And her name here is Charlotte Kahn, not Charlotte Salomon, but Charlotte Kahn, which means able. And here she is asserting herself as an agent. She is able to take her own destiny in her hands and to re-sculpt and to reshape her own theater of her life. I'd like to just scroll through some of these very, very quickly, because we really are brushing up against the time. If you could go back, Liz, just two more back. Yeah, and one more. One more, please. Yeah, so she takes us from her birth. Next. And notice how she puts all of these different scenes into one space. This is, in fact, a poster for her stepmother, who was an opera singer. And if you are in the website, you can actually click on this and listen to an actual recording of her singing Bach from the 1920s. Next slide. She records the day that Hitler becomes chancellor, with the troops all singing the Horst Wessel song, the anthem. Notice that the swastika is backwards. And next. She's preparing for the entrance exam to attend the art academy. She was a trained artist, a skilled artist, in fact. And you can see here these different iterations of her as she is drawing, furiously drawing under the watchful eye of the Van Gogh-inspired sunflower. She's in the south of France. She was born in Berlin, but and admitted to the Berlin Fine Arts Academy. And then next slide, please. She takes us, certainly, I think one of the things that we can see here not only is the influence of Van Gogh, but also of Chagall and of Matisse and of all of these artists who had been labeled and banned from Nazi Germany for being degenerate artists. Next slide, please. Notice here she's walking with her lover on the streets of Berlin with the swastikas really mapped out on the ground everywhere as they go. Next, please. Kristallnacht with this sign on the window, Juden raus, Jews out, and these two kind of hooligans saying, oh, I just stole a first-rate fountain pen at Cannes. Next, please. Death to the Jews, another representation of Kristallnacht in the fall of 1938. Next, please. And her father is imprisoned in Sachsenhausen. Next slide, please. Once he's released, the family gets together. They have a decision that they are going to send Charlotte to the south of France to get her out of harm's way. Next slide. And this really heart-wrenching panel, which is, you know, in these kind of sickly, almost nauseating tones of green and yellow, as she is sitting on one suitcase and contemplating the other suitcase. What does she put into the suitcase? What does she take with her as she leaves the only home that she's known, her language, her family, her friends? Next slide, please. And goes, next slide, ends up with her grandparents in the south of France. Next slide, please. She is, in fact, imprisoned in the summer of 1940 in the internment camp, the transit camp of Gurs. Next slide. And it's after this experience, one can say, the prompt for this work, Life or Theater, is the trauma of being imprisoned in Gurs, where she is really, I think, absolutely aware, in the way that Felix Nussbaum, who had been imprisoned in Saint-Cyprien in the south of France in another internment camp, both of them really the shock of being classified as German nationals and of being rounded up when Germany had made them stateless and being not denied protection by a country that, you know, had emancipated, first country to emancipate the Jews, the French Revolution, that stood for supposedly liberty, equality, and fraternity, and was here rounding up so many of the people that wanted to be protected. Next slide, please. Next. And here she is at the very end, really undertaking this project. We see her sitting by the Mediterranean. Absolutely sun-drenched landscape, the most deep saturated blue in front of her. And she's sitting there on her knees with what in front of her? An empty page about to be inscribed, about to be drawn. She's in the process of filling this page. Her brush is poised in the air, and I think contemplating not only her past, but how she would, in fact, shape and control her future. If you can look at the next slide, because we're shortly there. She decides that she's going to live. She decides life, not theater. She decides that she's going to create and not destroy. And this is now her mission. Next slide, please. Here we have the man that she met in the last year of her life, who was also a refugee, Jewish, Alexander Nagler, with whom she began a relationship and loved him and became pregnant. And he wanted to make a good, Jewish girl out of her. And they present themselves at the town hall in Nice for a marriage license in July of 1943. Mistakenly, because they have alerted the authorities that there were two Jews living in the vicinity, in the municipality. And a month later, in September, they are in fact arrested. They're taken to Drancy, and from there to Auschwitz. She is 5 months pregnant, noticeably pregnant, and whereas he is put on a work labor assigned to hard labor, she was killed the hour that she arrived in Auschwitz. And certainly here, as in many ways, we can see that gender absolutely mattered. Before she was taken away, she handed this entire series of 759 sheets over to a friend and said, "Good, take care of them. Take good care of them. They are my entire life." I'll say this, if you can just scroll through here to the next slide, Liz. I definitely think for me, and I'll end with this thought, that I think of all art really in this way, and with very much with this image in front of me of Charlotte Salomon sitting there with her brush poised, about to write, about to create. I think of all of the work, but particularly the work from this period of time, like a kind of letter, a missive, a message in a bottle. Paul Celan called a work of art a message in a bottle that would be sent out in the not always greatly hopeful belief that somewhere and sometime it could wash up on land, on heartland perhaps. I do think about works of art from this period as messages in a bottle that reach out to us and through space and time and connect us with the past in very, very important ways. Liz, is there one more slide after this or not?
Yes.
Can I? Is there another one?
No, I'm sorry, that's it.
Okay, so I'll leave you with Zalman Gradowski, and I'll leave you with another letter that he wrote. This was a letter that he buried, in fact, in the ground at Auschwitz. He was a member of the Sonderkommando, required to gas and then to cremate the bodies of the victims in Auschwitz. He was a former yeshiva student, a businessman, a writer, and one of the leaders of the Sonderkommando uprising to bomb the crematoria in October of 1944. Before he does that, he writes his own letter in which he enjoins us. It's a kind of ethical imperative that he is giving us. He says, "I write these words in the moment of my greatest despair." He, in fact, did perish and was killed in the revolt that he helped to organize and lead. But he says, I do not know, I do not believe if I will live to read these lines after the storm. Who knows if I will ever again behold a free man? What I'm writing will be the sole witness to what was my life. And his request, dear finder and publisher of these writings, find out who I am, then ask my relatives for the portrait of my family, as well as of my wife and me, and print them in this book that you will write. There's something so incredibly moving and optimistic about this future interlocutor, this future finder. We are all those future finders. And what does he want to know when you I beg you to shed a tear for them when you have their pictures before your eyes. So will that, I'll conclude this idea of portraits prompting us really to, not only to a kind of emotional empathy, right? A kind of identification, but also as a way to communicate and if not resuscitate the dead.